I've talked about the PlayStation Vita quite a bit on this channel. Despite it being over a decade old, it's still one of the coolest designs on the market, with emulation performance that still beats out some lower end options. Yet, like many folks out there, I kinda wish there were something a bit more modern, with a bit more emulation power. Maybe something in the style of a Sony handheld, but with some quality of life updates, like USB-C charging, trigger buttons, or maybe some extra RGB flourish. That's where the Trimui Smart Pro comes in. This budget handheld launched last year and looks like a modern cross between a PSP and Vita Slim. From a distance, it looks exactly like the kind of device that I've been looking for. So when LitNxt offered to send me a review unit to try out alongside the new-ish Surwish Crossmix OS, I jumped at the offer. For the past week, I've been running the system through its paces to answer the question, would this be a good modern option for fans of emulation on Vitas? And, well, sort of, if you're willing to live with just a few trade-offs. To dig into that a bit further, let's start with the design. As I mentioned before, the Trimui Smart Pro is a sort of mishmash of Sony handhelds. The shape of the handheld is very reminiscent of a slightly rounder, slightly heftier PSP, and feels similar in hand. The main difference here is that the back is completely smooth with just the slightest bit of curvature. Though far from uncomfortable, it does leave me wanting for a bit of extra grip, even if something as subtle as the pads on the back of a Vita. As it is now, my hands just kinda splay out on the back if I try to fully grip it. Taking a looser grip helps quite a bit, but has the knock-on effect of making the thumbsticks a bit less comfortable to reach. I very much understand why aftermarket grips for the Smart Pro exist. Nonetheless, while the body feels close to a PSP, the buttons and sticks up front feel remarkably similar to a Vita. The D-pad and action buttons have noticeably different designs, but the same sort of bouncy, soft click as those on a Vita. In practice, they've been incredibly responsive with just the right amount of tactile feedback. Using the D-pad for platformers has felt purposeful with no false diagonals in sight. It all feels just great to use. The digital shoulder and trigger buttons up top feel much the same. Very clicky, very responsive, also very small. They're comfortable and easy to hit, but not quite what someone would look for to play complex shooters. The joysticks, meanwhile, are probably the biggest downside here. These stubby nubs are pulled straight from a Vita. They work fine, but they're not great. I honestly have trouble using these sticks with any sort of precision on Sony's hardware. They're just a bit too small and slippery for my hands. But here, those problems are compounded by them being recessed and surrounded by an extra RGB ring. Together, those factors restrict the stick's movement quite a bit, making them feel even less responsive. From a usability standpoint, I'm not the biggest fan. However, it's all a matter of trade-offs. The RGB ring adds some additional flair to an otherwise plain-looking handheld. Plus, they do look nice as they respond to whatever colors dominate the display. If they ever get annoying, it's easy enough to shut them off in settings or toggle them off with the function key on the system's bottom. Recessing the sticks also allows them to only just barely sit higher than the face buttons. When stuffed in a pocket, this means they're less likely to snag, which is a problem I've had carrying around Vitas in the past. That's great, because at about the size of a large smartphone, the Smart Pro is very pocketable. I've had no issues walking around Chicago with it stuffed in my pocket or taking it on my daily commute. It's another reason why I'm kind of willing to overlook the flat back and tiny shoulders, to be honest. Everything about this handheld's shape feels streamlined toward making it compact and portable. Folks primarily looking for the most comfortable device to play N64 games and onward should probably look elsewhere. But if portability is a greater concern, there's a lot to love about this design. Though, don't get me wrong, I've still had a blast playing on this handheld. While not as comfortable as, say my Steam Deck, I've never felt particularly cramped while playing. CrossMix OS also feels nicely streamlined. I wish there were a few more customization options to remove menu items I don't use, like best in netplay, but there's little downtime between waking up the system and starting a game. The theming also feels busy but not cumbersome. On a lot of these handhelds, the themes are bearable but nothing to write home about, and games lists feel especially plain without any box art. Yet, here I actually quite like the feel of it all. Even with box art not populating for some games, it still feels visually comfortable to navigate. I'd honestly love to see more LitNxt handhelds adopt a similar feel. All of which is backed by some solid gameplay performance. Like any other handhelds that aren't complete garbage these days, the Smart Pro handles older systems through SNES and Game Boy Advance like a champ. I've not had any complaints thus far for any of those games. Even the rumble felt decent while playing Drill Dozer. The only real issue with older 4x3, 3x2, or 1x1 systems is going to be the black bars introduced due to the Smart Pro's 16:9 display. It's not ideal to not be able to use the entirety of a display, but it's also not ideal that RetroArch adds overlays to all the systems by default. For me, the overlays overstayed their welcome quickly and proceeded to be a hassle to disable. After some fumbling around in settings, I realized I needed to create or update underlying configuration files to stop the overlays from re-enabling after I quit a game. If you're a RetroArch expert, that might be obvious to you already, but for the rest of us, it'll be a bit of extra work while setting up a handheld like this. Past that awkwardness though, this 720p IPS display does look great. Colors are vivid and don't feel noticeably off from something closer to original hardware. It also gets just bright enough to play under direct sunlight without being overly reflective indoors. I dig it. Of course, the Trimui Smart Pro can play much more than those earlier systems. PS1 and Dreamcast performance are both exceptional on this device with default settings. Across the dozen or so games I tried across those systems, almost all ran at full speed without issue. The two exceptions were Ape Escape and Sonic Adventures. With Ape Escape, RetroArch seemed to have a difficult time using the controls as a DualShock controller. Certain directions had less range or failed to trigger, even after recalibrating the sticks and spending way too much time in settings. I didn't seem to have the same problem with Spyro 2, so I've no clue what's actually going on here. Just note that the rare games requiring dual sticks have a chance to be just a bit wonky. Sonic Adventures, meanwhile, had a few glitches early on that made a few textures disappear during cutscenes. Over half an hour of gameplay later, I haven't seen the same issues appear again. But it could be a sign that certain edge cases may not be perfect on this version of Flycast. Still, the remainder of my experience with both systems has been incredibly positive. I think a lot of folks would dig the Smart Pro as a cheap, pocketable PS1 and Dreamcast system. Where gameplay really starts to get funky is with N64 and PSP emulation. N64 is essentially hit or miss. A large portion of games will run perfectly fine on the Smart Pro. I've personally had no issues running Mario Kart 64 or Super Mario 64. They both just work. However, Paper Mario crashes hard at the beginning of the game, and Ocarina of Time has large graphical glitches throughout. Launching either game through standalone Mupen 64 instead of RetroArch helps a bit, but there's still plenty of issues which detract from the overall gameplay. The CrossMix devs posted an annotated compatibility list for N64 games over on GitHub if you're interested. However, unless there's a substantial update to emulator optimization, folks probably shouldn't buy a Smart Pro specifically for N64 games. PSP emulation is a bit more awkward. Out of the various games I've tried, the vast majority worked either perfectly or with issues so minimal that I don't think most folks will notice. Ape Escape on the Loose, in particular, has felt great to play and even runs smoothly at 2x resolution. The issues are some haphazard performance with more graphically intense games. God of War Chains of Olympus just barely manages to eke out full-speed gameplay in its opening sequence. Meanwhile, Ratchet & Clank's Size Matters is essentially unplayable. Given the system's design, it feels perfect for PSP emulation, but some combination of emulator optimization or increased chipset performance is still needed to make that happen. I do think plenty of folks could pick one of these up and have a great time playing PSP games. It's just worthwhile noting that some games may not work perfectly. Which all begs the question, is this actually the Vita emulation companion I've been looking for? And, well, sort of. There's no doubt that the Vita is better suited for PS1 and PSP emulation, but the Smart Pro still does a great job. It also feels a bit better to pick up and play for older consoles. And having easy access to solid Dreamcast emulation is definitely something the Vita can't beat. In a way, it kind of feels like a nice complement device to my Vitas that covers some of the emulation gaps of that system while maintaining a similar feel. The price also feels right. As an older device, the Trimui Smart Pro's price will vary a bit depending on where you buy it from. However, LitNxt, who sent me my unit, are selling theirs for around $70. Just be aware that Cross-Mix OS, which is what I've been showing off, is something that needs to be installed separately. Smart Pros don't typically ship with the custom OS pre-installed. It's completely free to install from the project's GitHub page. However, if you'd rather do less work yourself, plenty of retailers will also happily sell you a microSD card with it pre-installed for a small upcharge. It's really a matter of your personal preference. But still, regardless, for under $100 in solid performance through Dreamcast and PSP, the Trimui Smart Pro seems like a solid choice for those of us who really dig the design of old Sony handhelds, but want something a bit newer. Those are my thoughts though. Now's the time when I ask for yours. Are you someone who's looking to buy a Trimui Smart Pro but have extra questions? Or are you someone who's been using a Smart Pro for a while and have extra thoughts you'd like to share? Either way, let me know down in the comments. As always, if you found this video helpful or informative, go ahead and click the like button to let me know, and then get subscribed for more handheld reviews in the very near future. If you're interested in picking up a Trimui Smart Pro, I'll have a link to LitNxt's site down in the video description, alongside a discount code for 10% off. While they sent us a review unit, they didn't have any editorial approval into the making of this video and are seeing it for the first time alongside y'all. All they've asked is for us to share their website in this video. Also, if you're a Vita fan like myself, you might also want to check out my video series from last year, digging into the Vita's history and emulation capabilities. But otherwise, that's going to be all for this video. Thank you so much for watching all the way until the end. Until next time, catch you later.